So let's talk a little bit about the API server and API server enhancements. And we start, of course, here with UI enhancements. As we all know, in the past, there was a little bit discussion about Angular versions. And the good message is that with Identity Manager 9.3, we are now in parity with the LTS of Angular. That means the Identity Manager 9.3 is using the current LTS version 18 of Angular. Current means at the beginning of 2025. As we all know, there are some more minor versions as well, 19.1, 19.2, which are released in January this year or will be released in February this year. Nevertheless, I think the next version our developers will take a look at is then the 20 version, which is the next LTS, will be released somewhere in May 2025. We have integrated as well NX Mono Repo. This is a build system that helps to manage the different plugins. And it is, of course, available here. It will give us much more capabilities, includes as well caching and the distribution of the different plugins. Additionally to that exists now, or we are now using native ES 2017 modules. This at the end is something that allows us much faster to load applications and modules. The complete startup of the web portals we are providing is much faster than it was in the past. The next API server enhancements is the support of the Azure Key Vault. What is that? The Azure Key Vault is like a password management system, a system where you can store, for example, a connection string for web applications. This is where we are using that the most. That Azure Key Vault is now supported. From a principle, there are two ways available just to store things. You can store configuration in environment variables if you like to, but the more common way is to use the app settings.json. So if that vault is available, then of course there are two ways to handle your application. One way is of course the token-based access. This is for everything which is Microsoft applications, stuff that is hosted in Azure. And you can as well use certificate-based authentication. This is then more the way that is used for non-Azure apps. The configuration itself looks a little bit like you can see it in the screenshot there. Nevertheless, this is just a sample. It's not a working snippet. It shows more or less how the whole thing will look like. You have to fill more sense values into it. And of course, there are according websites from Microsoft describing what exactly needs to be defined. All the secrets are refreshed at a regular interval, and you can as well add other providers if you like it. That will work like in any plugin model. Another integration is, of course, the integration of open telemetry in the Identity Manager API server. And that happens with the Microsoft integration available with .NET 8 and Azure, and that is what Microsoft call application insights. The model looks more or less like here on the screen. This is the Microsoft screenshot, and that is how they are implementing OpenTelemetry and making them available for applications like the Identity Manager API server. What now is exactly integrated in the Identity Manager, or how the whole thing looks like? Let's look at the first box on the left upper. As a first of all, that complete tool is there to monitor application health. I think that is what we should say before we start with the rest. With that integration, it is possible, first of all, to get a profile of a running application and, of course, to detect performance outliers. Sometimes happens. You can as well monitor failing network requests. At the end, you get a better insight if there is something going wrong. Right side in green, the integration in the Identity Manager deployment, how that whole thing works. First of all, that is an installation of the application component that is completely optional. So you don't need to use that. You can use that if you like to. The much better and much more important message is the third message in that green box. This is not phoning home. So that means not that One Identity now collects your data or gets information about your running application. This is a local thing that is just for you in your environment, in your system maintenance. So not introducing of any type of telemetry. The next thing here on the left-hand side in red, it is what it is. It is a root cause analysis. It allows us from top to the bottom just to follow the operations chain and see where problems are, or look a little bit deeper into that execution. You see database request, script execution, customer methods call, everything you like. It is the best way to maintain your API server. And of course, you can as well see who initiated the different operations, if that is something of interest. Why at the end we use the application insights. That means why we are not using another type of implementation of OpenTelemetry. The reason for is very easy. That thing comes with Microsoft Azure, and everybody who has Azure for that, that is easy to get. The second thing to know is that, of course, it works as well for on-prem applications, and integrated in the application insights, there's as well support for distributed tracing. Also a little bit updated in the API server is the API documentation. You have seen that portal. That is what we call as the Swagger portal. However, that documentation page was upgraded again. More or less, each API project was getting its own section so that it is easier to differ between the different projects. And of course, some of these API bloats was just analyzed and of course consolidated in a way of that everything looks now a little bit more clean and not so messy. Very nice and very new, of course, in the API server is now the CRUD API support for custom tables. Remember, it is possible in the Identity Manager just to add data structures. You can do that with schema extensions, and the schema extender itself allows you as well to extend the API of the Identity Manager. What was not automatically extended is, of course, the API server, and what was necessary in the past. You need to define your own endpoints. You had to create your own API server plugins to make that structure available. This is an option that exists, of course, in the same way than before, but additionally to that exists now an automatically endpoint creator. If you like to enable that very specific feature for a custom data structure, then on the custom data table in dialog table in the Identity Manager, you will set a flag is API server enabled. This is a bit mask flag, and you can easily see how it works. You can disable that behavior. That means that custom data structure will not be available in the API server with 0. And then you can just go down the chain and say read, update, delete, and create. Every of these higher actions like create, for example, includes all the others. This is the easiest way to get an endpoint. You see, by the way, the endpoint at the end of the page, portal generic, and then name of your data structure, your table, to access it. Why we implemented that? The idea was just to save customer efforts in a way of that for a standard behavior of CRUD, such an endpoint can be created by configuration. You have just to set the value on that specific column and everything is good. What that not includes, of course, is if you want to make something pretty complicated or something very specific custom in that endpoint. For these type of scenarios, you need then, of course, to create again your own end with a specific data handling. Another new option is that in the API server, you can now define new generic filter criteria. And to do so, there is a new form. You can see that here on the right. That form allows you to create such filter criteria. It is like a standard filter criteria. You can, for example, take a property and say that is grant accessing to a specific entitlement. Then you will define the operator, in this case equal to, and then you start to build in the values. They can then be stored, and these generic filters can then be used. Why this is helpful? This is helpful because it allows to create properties which are not available in the data schema. So you get a virtual filterable property that can be used in your API endpoints, but there is no stored data structure in the database behind that provides that. And with that, you can generate such a data structure without just doing schema extensions and more complicated things. Additionally to the information given, it is important to understand that these filter providers are defined in a global structure. That means it is not per API method that you can just define that filter. It is a global structure where you can get access to these filters for everything what you need. New in the API server, one of the customer requests we got since a while, especially from enterprise customers, and these are customizable not found messages. What is behind that? If you try to get something from an API endpoint or from an API method and there are no objects returned, you get typically a generic not found message. That message says something like no objects found or something like that. That message typically don't tell you something about the objects maybe should be displayed on the screen. And to get the users a better idea what exactly is not displayed, it is now possible to customize these messages for specific objects. You can see that in an example here for the object type of person. That means identities. There was a specific object message defined, and you can see that in the last line. Instead of no objects found, there will then be something returned like this identity could not be found. And that is then much more detailed and helps as well during support. Some security enhancements happen to the API server as well, this time through the cross-origin resource sharing. This is a configuration that allows for a web portal to configure how the sharing of URLs to other projects than the application projects are getting handled. There are two parameters added into that handling. The first thing is the configuration, allow request origins. So if you want to include specific projects, web projects, basis, portal URLs, you want to make them available, then you can add these URLs. You see that here in the sample for the example.com. That is then a URL could be linked from the portal without running into issues. Second parameter that is configurable is now maximum age of pre-flight requests in seconds. That is then the configuration, how long such pre-flight requests are getting stored before they get wasted and needs to become checked again. Yeah, another security enhancement is to clean up a little bit the API. Why is that a security enhancement? The reason for is that by moving API endpoints underneath of specific structures, for example, additional security it can be assigned. Yeah, you see that for the endpoint here. IMX metadata, that was a metadata endpoint available across all applications, but it was not necessary just securely to sign in to the portal first. And this is now fixed in a way of that these metadata endpoints are now moved underneath of the portal. You can see that here as an example, portal metadata, which is the standard web portal, or operation support metadata, which is the other portal we have. And with moving these endpoints underneath of portal or operations support, we secured them because now it's necessary to sign in before you can use them. And more security enhancements. The first thing is related to cookies. There was something stored in cookies, and that was, of course, the session data. Therefore, sometimes persistent cookies was at the end used, and that is now completely gone and removed from the system. So we are not storing any longer persistent authentication cookies. These session data is now stored in a database table, QBM Session Store. There you can find them, and with that, only session cookies are left. And of course, the authentication information is not part of the cookies anymore. Right-hand side on the slide, the administration portal allows now the configuration of HTTP header properties. You can see them here. There are 3 properties and the default settings listed on the right-hand side. And now a very specific configuration, and that is the configuration of API URLs, and that means additionally API URLs. Standardly, the web portal, if you just sign in, does have its specific URL. Technically, something like HTTPS and then server name, domain, whatever, /API server /portal. And that thing is then using the API server as its reference to get or to address API calls to. This is part of the configuration of the portal, and it is known once you sign in or once you reached your portal and the portal was started. However, there are scenarios outside at the customer where customer want that you can sign in on each API server you like, but the API underneath that is then later be used, that should be a very specific API server. And therefore the feature is you can now configure a specific URL that the portal or the API server later is using just to connect to the API. This is not completely without problems, especially because of cross-referencing. You remember, web servers or browsers don't like if the application you use uses a complete different server address to get something. And so you have to solve a security issue if you want to do or if you want to configure something like that. And so my recommendation will be keep the default. That means don't configure these API URLs. But if you live in a scenario where you want to connect to a very specific API server, and of course you have your security completely well configured, in these cases you can enter here another URL, and that will then be the URL that will be used to connect to the API server if the API tries to do so. And now let's talk about the JSON library. In the past, we used the Newtonsoft JSON library. That was the old standard. With using .NET 8, we are now using the system.text.json library. What's the difference between both libraries? There are some, of course, and they are pretty good described in an article from Microsoft linked on the right-hand side. But the majority of differences is first, the new JSON library is more restrictive. That means you have to ensure that your JSON is very well formatted. The second reason is the performance of the new JSON library is much better. And from a security perspective, there's an improvement as well. If you move from the one or the other, that means if you want to change your JSON format, there are 2 major differences we need to talk to. First of all, property names must now be quoted. Now, there is a JSON syntax where you don't need to quote JSON property names. You have only to quote the values as long as we are talking about string values. But that is now different. In the new system.text.json library, you have now to ensure that even property names are quoted. The second major difference is that now sensitive characters are automatically escaped. That is, from a security perspective, very, very good. And that was, of course, a reason why we used now the new library. Like always, we are migrating every JSON everywhere as we know about it. That means our system JSONs, wherever they are used, are getting automatically updated. If you use in your code somewhere JSON as well, then you have to ensure that your custom code all takes care of that new system text JSON library we are using. And to get the complete overview about the differences, use the URL on the right-hand side from Microsoft. The API SDK is now as well moved to GitHub. Yeah, I know that discussion from a training perspective. There was many questions about where the API was gone and in which version the API is part of, because it was part of the standard IMX client project in the past. However, this is now completely modified. The whole thing was moved to GitHub, and it will, of course, extended on GitHub in the future. You can find it there as identitymanager.api SDK. And now let's start talking about features of the standard web portal and improvements. We will do that in two sections. In the first section, we'll talk about not available or new features. And in the second section, we will then talk about UX improvements. First, starting with the list of not available features in two groups. So in the standard web portal, not available today is the assignment of ADS machine in ADS group. Yeah, that's a direct assignment. The admin, from an admin perspective, to add computers into Active Directory groups is not supported. Of course, this is supported from other tools like the manager tool, for example, but in the web, this is not available. Second components not available in the standard web portal of Identity Manager 9.3 is first the Epic support. Again, this is not available in the standard web portal. You can handle Epic if you like to, for example, using the manager and the other on-premise tools. It is possible that these features maybe get delivered with 9.3.1, but that is just my estimation. This is nothing you can count on. A complete different story is the data governance module. And here it is important to understand that in Identity Manager 9.3, absolutely no data governance module is included. Reason for that, of course, is that, we moved to .NET 8. I think we talked about that a little. And part of that was as well that the data governance stuff was necessary to get reviewed to include .NET 8 instead of .NET Framework. And that was not possible until the release time of Identity Manager 9.3, and with that, the complete data governance modules and support is not available. What does that mean for a partner or a customer? Quite clear. If you are working with data governance and you like to continue with that, you can't use Identity Manager 9.3. We hope that in 10.0 that is inserted again, but you have to skip this version if you need data governance at all. If you don't need data governance, no problem. And if you don't need data governance any longer, no problem at all. But be aware of, if you just install Identity Manager 9.3, you have to deactivate data governance modules and you might lose data. New in the Identity Manager standard web portal is now asynchronous UI processing. This has no contact with the asynchronous working Identity Manager engine. We are talking about long-running mass operations in the standard web portal. For example, you have 250 approvals. You want to approve them at once with one reason. You select all 250 with select all and you hit the button. In the past, in the web portal, it took some seconds/minutes until the web portal returned and say, I did it. And this is now different. You can see we are now processing these type of things asynchronously. On the right-hand side, you see the asynchronous page where you can follow the process. In this case, there was, I think, round about 38 attestation approvals, round about 43 request approvals. You see what happened. You see as well error messages if the one or the other case from the bulk is not really working or was not really approved in this case. Then you can look into the details of each of these errors, and it is as well possible, if you drill into it, to redo the complete task. Yeah, sometimes that makes sense depending on the error message. Sometimes it will never work, but you have the chance to redo one failed action if you like to. New feature in the standard web portal is a security feature. This security feature is affecting login. You know that scenario. There is whatever else, script or bot or how, and that tries to log in many times to a portal, always using a different password to get logged in, like a brute force on your user account. There is a common sense in the meantime. That common sense is described following the so-named OWASP rules. And that is that after a specific amount of logins, the front end returns and say, hey, I'm not sure, you could be a bot, please just enter a captcha. And if you can enter the captcha, then I'm sure you are a human and you are only not able to enter your password correctly, so try it again. And this display and usage of a captcha is something which is now as well implemented in the Identity Manager login behavior. The whole thing looks as follows. You start logging in many times to the screen, and it's not possible at the end because your password is wrong or your user information is wrong, whatever it is. And then the tool says, okay, you are not able any longer to log in. First, please enter the captcha. I think in this case it's a Google captcha, but that's not that important. Different captchas are able to configure. Then you have to fill out this wonderful captcha. We all know about that. And this will then automatically enable your password field again, and then you can try it a next time. This is security, from my perspective, very well done and absolute state of the art. Another feature, and that is what you can see here on the screen as well, is that we improved the table display in a way of that you can now click on headers to get the tables sorted. Depending on the column where you click on the header, there will then be a button up or a top down sort, and that will then affect your display of the table. The second feature implemented as well, something absolutely standard, is that it is now possible in a more page table, which in an enterprise is the standard, you can directly jump to the first or to the really last page of your dataset. Both features, from my perspective, are standard. Nice that they are working now in Identity Manager 9.3, and with that, discussions around this should now come to an end. As we all know, the feature role recommendations is just to recommend which role could be assigned in difference or as an option to direct assignments. However, this type of role recommendations is at the end just suggesting each role that the system can find, even if there is, for example, a read-only membership or something else assigned. With the new optimization, read-only memberships are now automatically excluded. Additionally to that, it is possible that you want to recommend something, but there is one or two or three roles you want to absolutely exclude because they are for admin purposes or should be hidden or whatever. In these cases, it is now possible with the second option here on the screen just to define such exclusion roles so that they as well are not part of any role recommendation. Let's talk about the password recess portal. As we all know, the password reset portal typically is started from the login screen of the standard web portal. I don't know my password. I click on the link to get a new one using the password reset portal. Because of that, the decision was made in the past that the password reset portal should just get its authentication modules to be used from the standard web portal. Unfortunately, that makes not a lot of sense in broader scenarios, and because of that, the decision was made in 9.3 that the password reset portal gets its own authentication configuration. You can now step into your configuration of the Identity Manager, find there in QBM products the password reset portal, and like for all the other portals, you can now define the available authentication modules to be used. Additionally to that, there are two new configuration keys as well implemented that allows to log in with password questions or with a passcode. You can configure that. From a migration perspective, it makes a lot of sense just to look into the configuration of your password reset portal if you use that. Because it was getting something in the past and it has now the ability to get its own authentication modules, it might make sense to check that configuration if it fits to your company needs. More and more features for disabling or enabling are important for security reasons. We implemented a lot in the API of Identity Manager 9.3 in addition to what exists as well, starting on the left-hand side. It is now possible globally to turn off the creation of new objects. There are scenarios outside where people can manage and update and whatever else do with objects, but what they not should do are creating new ones. And because of that, there are global options available now, and these global options will disallow creating of specific objects. You can see them in the list. That is a feature available for identities, departments, locations, cost centers, business roles, system roles, application roles, and team roles. Right-hand side of the slide. It is as well possible per option just to deactivate the possibility to delegate. Additionally to that, it is as well able to disable the feature to manage web auth keys. There are scenarios outside where these features are necessary. I don't have samples to, but there are customers saying we are configuring that from an admin perspective. People should not be able to do that. The same thing for the delegation feature, of course. The last option is as well a disable option, and that option disables the standard functionality that you can select products per peer group analysis. Maybe in scenarios where it is not very common that you should look what the colleague has and get the permissions of the colleague, that could be a good thing. But please remember, all of these disable features are global options. That means if you configure them, the complete web portal users are not able to use that any longer. If you try to delegate your permissions, typically you can delegate these permissions to everybody. That means if you go into your vacation and from your perspective the facility manager should do your decisions, then it is possible to assign this to the facility manager. If that makes sense from a business perspective, that is something we can talk about. However, since 9.3 of the Identity Manager, it is now possible to create an exclusion list. You can easily see that here on the right side. If we look into that form, then you can configure the delegation, and the delegation in this case is just following the condition is inactive equals 0, which means you can only delegate to people which are active in the system. That means you can't delegate to inactive people, whatever the reason for inactivity is. This is now possible, and of course you can use other conditions if you like to. If you need that feature or not is depending on you. Personally, I think letting the people think sometimes helps a little bit to keep them thinking. And last but not least, we have here a changed configuration key. In the past, for specific features in the portal, there was the capability to disable the hyperview navigation. to streamline that in a way of that everything works in the same way, the wording of that disable thing was just reverted and inverted in a way of that it is possible to use the hyperview navigation. Because of that, all the disable keys was just renamed. There are now enable keys, as you easily can see. And of course, the value was as well converted. It is now showing the opposite because disable and enable are the opposite. So the value will be the opposite as well. If you have used that configuration in your customization, of course, this is something we can't change. Here you have to double check the functionality again. It is now exactly the opposite of what you expected in the past.